Today, on Be Something Wonderful, how to ignore 3D reality and dwell in your wish fulfilled. I am your host, Tom Karen, and this is the Be Something Wonderful studio of higher consciousness, where we help you level up and become the best version of yourself. Creators, welcome back. I met with one of my clients over the weekend, and she needed some guidance on this idea of, Tom, what about ignoring 3D reality? I really struggle with that. And I think I get into my wish fulfilled, into that feeling of fulfillment okay. It's just when things come up in 3D, I'm just uncertain what I'm supposed to do. Well, guys, we're going to talk about this today and more. I want to really start where I always start. And then I want to take it up a level. I want to see if we can really level this up on this idea of disregarding 3D reality, or as Neville says and others, ignoring 3D reality. So it's not about trying to ignore 3D reality. That's the first thing I want to say. Trying to ignore it keeps you focused on it. In fact, it means that you agree with that reality. And if you agree with it, that means you believe it. And if you believe it, that means it's your reality. Do you hear this? You've got to let it, if you try to ignore it, you're believing in it. And it keeps it real. It's when you pull your awareness from it, when you pull your belief from it, when you retrieve the time, space, and attention from it, it must dissolve. So it's not about trying to ignore it. Rather it's about your light, right? About giving time, space, and attention to what you desire by feeling the fulfillment of it. Do you hear this? So it's about pulling your attention from what you don't want, from that reality, and giving it to what you do want. We've talked about this, but we're going to take it up a notch today, maybe several notches, right? 3D reality, remember, is manifested potential. So I really want you to think about this. When you're looking at 3D reality, you're looking at the past, already manifested, but behind that manifested reality is source energy, is the energy that's always changing, always moving, right? Always becoming something else, right? And behind that energy that always becomes something else is that unchangeable reality of that love of God, of that one energy, that one love that never changes, right? So 3D reality is manifested potential. When you try to ignore it or deny it, you agree it is real for you. That's how I want to start. We're going to talk about how to quote, ignore it, but it's really not about ignoring it. It's putting your attention on what you do want, right? You agree it's real for you when you try to ignore it. Instead, accept it. We've talked about this as one quantum possibility out of an infinite number of possibilities, and choose how you want to mold that potential in that moment of now. Do you see it? You're molding that reality. So you can see it, you can look at it and say, okay, that's one quantum possibility. I no longer choose that. And then put your attention on what you do want. Mold it. Because remember, it's constantly changing form into what you do want. Take your attention from it, go within to your imagination, right? Or your assumptions, right? Within, remember, it's all within you. And move to what you want, right? Put all your attention on your wish fulfilled. Turn within and light up your desired future, right? But not from the lower mind, not from desiring and needing it. Do you hear this? So you might be imagining your wish fulfilled, but you might be doing it from a state of desiring something to change, of really wanting and needing something to change. Now you're stuck into a lower state of mind trying to change things by imagining, but you're not moving up, you're not rising in consciousness where you need to be. Let's take this a little further. So one of you posted, and I loved it, on the Facebook page, the ambassadors, you posted this picture of Daniel turning his back to the lions in the lion's den. This is the story of Daniel and the lion's den. I think it's a perfect synchronicity to talk about what I was talking about with this client right? And remember, Daniel, the story of Daniel, remember, Daniel was the dreamer, right? That would interpret dreams, right? So automatically we're pointing towards, or the metaphysical meaning is that that's his imagination. Dreams means they're pointing to, Daniel could imagine, could go within. Daniel represents that spiritual thought, or that spiritual side of you, that spiritual part of you. That's what Daniel represents in the story. Remember, Daniel was a slave in Babylon, but then he rose up in the ranks, right? He adapted to the environment. In other words, Babylon, remember, represents your lower senses. It represents material consciousness, right? And Daniel was an Israelite. In other words, Israel represents higher spiritual thought. So Daniel represents the higher spiritual thought among the 3D material consciousness. Do you see this? This is you. You're both, right? So Daniel, it was said that he was a just man who rose to power in Babylon. He was put in charge over 120 provinces. He was one of 3 governors. And we'll talk about this in a minute. But he was an Israelite. Well, why do they say that? Because he was captive, right? He was captive, but he rose up. He adapted above the captivity, meaning you're always in captivity by your lower state of consciousness, by material consciousness, unless you bring it to awareness, unless you connect with those spiritual thoughts within you, like Daniel, right? And Daniel was in charge, one of 3 governors, but he wasn't like the others, right? He was a just man, meaning this is talking about right minds, right thoughts, right? He wasn't in the weeds of the 3D consciousness like the 2 other governors, taking bribes. That was represented by taking bribes and things like that. He wasn't after it for the money or the power. Right? He represented the spiritual. Babylon, remember, is material 3D consciousness, or the captivity of lower thought, of doubt and confusion. Right? And so what happened with Daniel? Well, Daniel was one of the 3 governors over these provinces. And the king Darius liked him so much. And remember, King Darius in this case represents the 3D world, but represents your 3D will. So King Darius loved Daniel, meaning your 3D will, that 3D you, loves that higher spiritual thought. Okay? So Daniel was a favorite of the king. But the other 2 governors, if you remember the story, were jealous. And they heard that Daniel would be promoted to be over the entire kingdom. This was King Darius's plan because he really loved Daniel. Remember, Daniel was just. He was the right man. He was a favorite. He could do no wrong, right? They couldn't find anything on him, right? And Daniel, if you remember, prayed every day, 3 times a day. And we'll get to this in a second, right? So he believed in God, in the God within, not an outside God, but the only God, the God within, in your imagination, right? So these 2 other governors were scheming. Well, what can we do? We have nothing on Daniel to oust him, right? To get him in disfavor from the king. So they came up with a plan, a scheme, because they knew that he prayed not to the king or an outside God, but to what they called his God, Daniel's God, which was the God within, the only God, right? That one power, that one love, the Christ within you. That's your God. That's God, right? So he prayed there. So they said, they're gonna get the king to pass a decree that says if you pray to anybody but the king, if you praise anybody or pray to anybody other than the king, in other words, what they thought would be an outside God, outside of the king, then you will be thrown in the den of lions to be eaten by the lions. This was the plan, right? So great scheme here, right? So, King Darius felt that he had no other choice but to sign this decree. Remember, King Darius, the 3D you, trapped within the materiality of the 3D world, the rules and the regulations, right? In the customs of the 3D world, right? The beliefs, the doubts and the fears, all of that, right? So the king signs it. And then sure enough, Daniel was praying as usual, and they caught him. And then they brought it to the king's attention. Now the king, remember, loved Daniel. Your 3D you, the will, your 3D will, loves that higher spiritual thought. Just doesn't have the control without that spiritual nature, right? So the king had no choice but to throw Daniel into captivity, into the den of lions, right? So let's unpack this a little bit more. We know the story, right? Daniel came out the next day. The king was looking for him, and Daniel was unharmed, right? He turned away and turned within to God. But I really want to unpack this because this really represents you. You're the king, the 3D will represents you. The other governors, the other sort of nasty thoughts and fears that come up. And Daniel, of course, your spiritual self, right? Daniel represents mastering the limitations and temptations of the 3D world by not desiring and resisting, right? Just turning his back on it. Like the lions, he turned his back on the lions, or turned his back on those thoughts can be ferocious, right? And if you let them get to you, they will eat you alive. Doubt and fear will virtually eat you alive. That's what was going on here. So just turning his back by developing his higher spiritual thought and understanding. And remember, he was loved, but King Darius acted in ignorance, right? That's your 3D will. That's the 3D you acting in ignorance. Represents your 3D will that is either moved by lower thought or is moved by enlightened spiritual thought. So many times we let ourselves get moved. This is the real point I wanted to make today. Get moved by that lower thought of doubt and fear. So you could be imagining your wish fulfilled. And you could be ignoring what we call ignoring or denying the 3D world. But you're still not believing totally in your spiritual authority, in that divinity within you, that higher thought, right? You're moving to it. You're imagining your wish fulfilled, but you're imagining from a sort of a 3D state of lack and absence of it, as opposed from that higher spiritual state, that belief in your inner authority. That's really what I wanted to get, because that's what this story represents, right? Daniel, so what's the idea? Make faith in your wish fulfilled your dwelling place instead of doubt, fear, and limitation, right? And this is what it was said about Daniel. When Daniel heard that they had a declaration, a decree, this is what he did. When Daniel knew that the document was signed, this comes from Scripture, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber, he had windows toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying, giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. This is when Daniel was caught, right? He heard about the decree, but he persisted. Persisted in what? In your wish fulfilled. Persisted in your imaginal act. Persisted in your spiritual authority. So it's not so much about denying and running away from the 3D world. Daniel didn't run from the lions, right? He turned within. So he wasn't so much denying or rejecting the lions as he was turning within to his spiritual authority. Do you see the difference? He persisted despite the evidence, despite the facts. Even when he knew the document was signed, he continued to pray, and it says he prayed as he always did. Let's look at what we hear. The document was signed. He knew it, so he persisted anyway. Then he entered his house. He entered within, right, his imagination. And then it says his house was now in his roof chamber that had windows toward Jerusalem. Jerusalem is your spiritual center. It's your highest consciousness. It's your higher consciousness. The roof chamber, right, is pointing towards the above, right? Above is where is your spiritual nature, your higher consciousness, right? Open towards Jerusalem, and then it says he continued, frequency, we're talking about frequency, kneeling on his knees. Hear this. They say this, that he continued kneeling on his knees. They were very specific here. What are they pointing at? They're pointing to his inner authority. He was kneeling, bowing his 3D will to that higher will of God, right? He was saying, let your will be done, not mine, right? Yours be done, not mine. Kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God as he had been doing previously. Giving thanks, praying in advance, right? Giving thanks in advance, right? 3 times, remember the number 3, it doesn't mean 3 times in terms of frequency, it means frequent, right? 3 times means complete, whole. You continue returning to that dwelling place, continuing your wish fulfilled until you feel it real, until you feel the fulfillment. So 3 times represents wholeness or completeness, or until you are fulfilled, right? So there it is. It's this idea of gratitude in advance. Daniel made it a habit of feeling fulfilled. It was the frequency. It became the dwelling place. That's the point I wanted to make here. Daniel always prayed, right? Always developing that spiritual nature, right? But so when you're sort of running away from 3D and you haven't really developed that belief in your inner authority, you will be shaken by 3D appearances. Do you see this, right? Even when the lions come out, right? The ferocious doubt and fear sets in. You will turn your back and you'll turn within because you've developed that spiritual authority. You've developed that belief, that gratitude in advance. You're standing in your knowing now. Do you see this, guys? This is big today. So then it says in Scripture, in Daniel 6:17, your God whom you this is King Darius when he had to deliver Daniel to the lions. He had no choice. He didn't want to. He loved Daniel, remember. But because your 3D will doesn't really, it's not the 3D will's conscious choice to do this, right? But it's overcome by doubt. It's overcome by fear, right? And so finally, though, even when you're overcome by doubt and fear in the 3D appearances, you give it to God. You give it to your inner authority, right? You finally trust in your inner authority. That's what King Darius, that's what this represents here. He says to Daniel, your God whom you constantly serve will himself deliver you. That, remember, you play all the parts. So in this case, you're King Darius as well. Giving it to God, knowing that God will deliver you. In other words, your imagination. Believing in your inner authority to rise in consciousness to your wish fulfilled. And it will manifest, right? You're trusting in your inner authority. And then it was said that when he was put in the lion's den, a stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den. That represents going within, right? Even though, so he's in the lion's den, it's closed now. That represents Daniel really going within and praying, right? Feeling that wish fulfilled. You will either be saved by your higher spiritual thought of faith when you're imagining your wish fulfilled and turning your back on 3D reality, or you'll be eaten alive by ferocious and savage thoughts of doubt and fear. That's what those lions represent, right? Those thoughts, because they feel ferocious and like savaging us, right, at times, right? And then of course Daniel, right, turns up and within, right, to God, to his inner authority, feels the fulfillment, feels it real, feels it done, stands in that knowing, despite the appearances of the 3D world, despite the lions and the thoughts and all that negativity that's around you. Despite that, right? And this is what, and when the king comes to find him, my God, that's what he says, my God, shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me. I was found innocent before him. In other words, you're saved. That's what salvation is. You're saved, but that I am awareness within you, that God within you, that Christ within you is your Savior, right? That higher thought, that spiritual, your imagination, imagining your wish fulfilled. That's what saves you, right? You were never condemned. You were never guilty, right? And Daniel was never guilty, right? The only time you could, and remember, sin is missing your mark, but you always get, it's continual forgiveness. So you're continually forgiven, and you always can re-identify and rise and identify with that higher concept of yourself. That's what's going on here, guys. This is a powerful lesson here on how to ignore 3D reality and really rest really live or really dwell in your wish fulfilled. I am your host, Tom Karen, and this is the Be Something Wonderful studio of higher consciousness, where we help you level up and become the best version of yourself. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification button, like and share our videos. That's how we get our message out. You can follow us on Facebook at Be Something Wonderful, on Instagram and Twitter at Tom Karen. Also, guys, we have a Facebook group called the Be Something Wonderful Ambassadors. You can join that. You can follow us on our website at tomkaren.com or besomethingwonderful.com. I'm also leaving a link to another video that I did about a year ago that also unpacks the Lion's Den, Daniel in the Lion's Den, from a different angle, but the same type of thing, and I'll leave a link below. Guys, until next time, with great love, with great light, and infinite gratitude, this is Tom. See you soon.